And now you start.
Okay, good afternoon and good morning, everyone. I'm Nir Kosti from LMU Munich, and I'm co-hosting this session with Professor David Levi-Farou from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem as part of our project on the metric of regulation. A bit background on our project to set the stage. So our project aims to understand the state of art in regulatory measurements and to explore innovative approaches in this field. Regulatory measurements covers a broad range of elements: regulatory institutions, regulatory text, public opinion, performance metrics, and so on. But fundamentally, it involves the quantification of regulations themselves. As many of you know, and I guess this is part of the reasons you're here with us today, regulatory measurement is a complex field and regulations can be quite challenging to quantify. When we talk about regulations, what exactly we are counting, how we count regulations. Scholars have developed various methods to address these questions, and here to guide us with some broad knowledge about them is our speaker today, Professor Stuart Shapiro from Rutgers University, who will go over these methods, at least in the American context, offering insights into their strengths and limitations, and also suggesting alternative ways to count and improve our understanding of regulation and their analysis. But before we begin, David will provide a short introduction to Stuart.
So thank you very much, Nir. And let me say a few things about Stuart. He's the dean of the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy in Rutgers. He's the dean from April 2023. He joined Rutgers University 21 years ago in 2003. He has a PhD from Harvard University, the Kennedy School of Government. He has experience in government because he worked at the Office of Management and Budget under Clinton and Bush, George Bush. He teaches classes in economics, public policy, politics. He wrote 3 books and many journal articles. And we are very happy to have you with us, Stuart. We are following your work on impact assessment and regulation for many years, and it's a pleasure to have you as part of the project. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Nir. Thank you, David. It is a pleasure and honor to be here and to be talking to such a wide and wide-ranging audience from looking at the names on the screen here. I am going to share my screen now. Let's do that. There we go. So the name, this is a paper, it actually came out yesterday. I have a link at the end and I can drop it in the chat as well later. The name of the paper is Counting Regulatory Burden and Measuring Regulatory Impact, a Call for Nuance. This is, as Nir pointed out, in the United States context. Everything here that I say pertains to counting regulation in the United States. And the project was motivated by some frustration. The challenge is that there are a lot of numbers out there in debates over regulatory policy here in the United States. And they are all in many ways flawed. And so I wanted to think a little systematically about the ways that we have counted regulation here in the US and the ways that they are flawed, and to think about what we could do better. It was also motivated by a paper I worked on with, and I know David knows Carrie Colanisi well, and Natasha Sarin, where we were attempting to measure the impact of the Trump administration on the regulatory state. And there's a working paper out there called Deregulatory Deceptions, and we came up with a new way to count. And it was, I think, a lot better than everything that had been done before in terms of counting strict numbers and regulations, but it was amazingly challenging, and even at the end of the day had its flaws with it. And so on my own, I turned to this project. Let me advance here. It's going to be like that if I do that. Okay. Is that okay? Okay. Let me
That's fine.
Might be better to have this one.
Yeah, let me just do that. Okay. And then I will zone that out. Okay.
Excellent.
So because the US context, most of the counting of regulation has occurred by people that want to see less regulation, to put it bluntly. And so they have gone into the counting enterprise with an aim to show that there's too much regulation. And not surprisingly, they produce very large numbers. Some of them attach those to impact and try to correlate those, or do regression analysis with macroeconomic variables. But because their preferences are clear, there is reason to doubt their motivation and their work. And therefore, there has emerged a large group of their critics that argue that we shouldn't count. And that counting inevitably leads to biased estimates. And they do this by doing very good analyses of the counts that exist and criticizing them. So I wanted to start by talking about why, despite that problem, I think it's important to count. And that there is something that counts done well could potentially tell us and could inform policy. And I have several reasons here. The first is, at a very real level, cumulative impact of regulation matters. You talk to small business owners, and that one of the things they're frustrated at, they're usually not frustrated, in my experience, with particular regulations, particularly if they understand why something's being regulated. They're all happy to improve the environment or protect their workers in general. What they resent doing is the same thing over and over again, or things they don't have any effect, or things they think are not helping or not making a difference. And sometimes that comes from a place of not wanting to pay the costs, absolutely. But it also comes from the fact, in the United States, many people are subject to federal, state, and local regulations. I imagine that there are similar situations in the EU, that many of these requirements duplicate each other, or don't quite duplicate each other, so you have to do the same work twice in order to comply. And all of this does have a real cost. So I think that's one reason that counting in an intelligent way does matter. The second way is one thing that counts have done somewhat, and we did this in the paper with Kerry Colanisi, is they do tell us something about how changes in presidential administration, gubernatorial administration at the state level, or reforms that get put in place, like regulatory budgets or 2-for-1 reforms, whether they work or not, or whether or not they're having the effect that people say they are having. And so good counts can tell us how politics affects regulations and how procedure affects regulations. The other reason is that what's out there are largely bad counts. And if we don't make an effort to improve the way we measure impact, then it's going to be the bad numbers that hold the day. And my last bullet on there, numbers have power. And if one side is talking about thousands of regulations or billions of dollars in regulatory costs, that tends to dominate the debate, and that tends to lead to policy changes in the regulatory state that may not be wise. And then finally, a lot of the work that is done in this area focuses on the burden on business. Indeed, in the example I just gave, that's what I mentioned. But cumulative burden also affects individuals. When someone has to fill out lots of forms in order to get food stamps or Medicaid or to vote, these are people that in general don't have time for that to do that. It imposes both a physical and cognitive burden on them, and understanding the cumulative nature of that burden would help us make better policy, particularly in getting benefits that people are entitled to those people. Okay, so what's the problem with what we do now? All right, well, the first thing we do now is we count rules. We say, how many are there? And this is a reasonable place to start. It's not it's not a wrong question in any way, but it's really much harder to do than people think. The first thing we do, the Federal Register, for those of you that don't know, the Federal Register is published 5 days a week in the United States, and it's basically the government communicating with the public. And it contains regulations, it contains final rules, it contains proposed rules, but it also contains a lot else. It contains notices, it contains meeting announcements, it contains things under the Paperwork Reduction Act, it contains corrections. And so looking at Federal Register pages and even just taking the rules, which is not that hard to do, leaves a lot to be desired, because even in the rules, what you're getting is you're not getting, is this regulatory or deregulatory? Many rules may be long without having much of an impact, or maybe short and have a tremendous impact. And counting them all the same way or just using pages doesn't really get at anything important. So one step up from this is the Code of Federal Regulations. Once something is final in the Federal Register, eventually it gets codified and published in the what we call the CFR. The CFR is better because it's just regulations. It gets rid of a lot of the detritus, like notices and meetings and proposed rules and things like that. But there's also still a lot else in there. And it really, first of all, it only goes up. So it's not going to the CFR rarely, if ever, gets smaller. But if you add exceptions to a regulation, let's say, that adds more CFR pages, that adds more CFR documents. A page in the CFR has no attachment to telling us about the impact or what's actually going on in the regulation. So it's better than the Federal Register. There's some okay studies out there that use CFR, but there's still a lot of problems with it. With the advent of large language models and technology, scholars, particularly Patrick McLaughlin and others at the Mercatus Institute, have looked at regulatory restrictions. They've looked for words like must or required, and see how often did those words occur. And this is clever. This is something that I think advances the discussion. But again, it lacks nuance, getting back to the title of my article. If something says someone must not do something, that counts as a must. If someone says that they should not do something, it should. If it says one person must do something but others don't have to, that counts as a requirement on everyone. So there is something there with these restrictions, but there is also some of the confusion that comes in from just counting pages and documents. All right, so let's maybe look at only those documents that really are a bigger deal. And here I draw on my experience at the Office of Management and Budget, where I worked at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which reviews the significant regulations each year. And the Biden administration just changed the definition of this, which is probably a good thing, but also will make comparisons moving forward harder. But even looking historically, looking at the rules reviewed by OMB, I think is an improvement because it does get out a lot of the regulations that are sort of standard or typical. The challenge here is one of under-inclusivity. Not all regulatory agencies are included by OMB. They don't look at the Federal Trade Commission. They don't look at the Securities and Exchange Commission, what we call independent commissions. They don't look at rules that are close to significant, but not actually significant. So those counts are better, I think, but problematic. Finally is the technique that Carrie Colonisi and I used on our Trump paper. The Unified Agenda is published twice per year, and it does list all actions finalized. It lists a lot of other things, including plans and proposals, but it lists all actions finalized, and those are isolatable. As I mentioned at the outset, some of these, doing this is burdensome, even with reasonably good technology tools, although maybe it has gotten better in the 4 years since we did this. And some of the data is not good. Some of the classifications of regulation are mistaken. The big problem underlying all of these, and it underlying the way I talked about them, I think, though, is that by itself, we don't know what these numbers mean. Is 3,000 regulations a year a lot? Is it too many? Is it too few? And almost all of these analyses using these things don't answer that question. They just throw the number out there, and because those numbers are big, assume that you will understand that it is big. So instead, we rely, and David mentioned that I've done a lot of work on regulatory impact assessment over the years. We rely on cost-benefit analysis to maybe give us a different perception. Agencies, for those of you that don't know, are required to do cost-benefit analysis on a subset of their significant rules, the ones up until last year that had $100 million in impact in any given year. Starting last year, $200 million became the threshold. And OMB keeps data on this. They issue annual reports. The reports got a little spotty during the Trump administration, and that spottiness has continued in the Biden administration. But we are close to up to date now after some delays with that data. And this gives you a number of dollar impact. Done well, it would give you a number of the impact both of costs and of benefits, unlike all the other numbers on the previous page, which are almost always just framed as rules are bad things. Cost benefit could give you cost data and benefit data. The problem is agencies don't always do a great job. Many agencies just measure cost because they feel it's easier. The number of regulations with benefits is smaller than the number of regulations that measure costs. And there's also reason to doubt the quality of some of the analysis. It's all ex ante analysis. Ex post analysis have shown that that costs and benefits both tend to get overestimated in initial analyses. But this gets us, if this were done well, this would get us to closer. But it is still under-inclusive. There's still all those regulations from the independent commissions that don't do cost-benefit analysis. And then there are rules that probably should do them that don't. This data is good for trends, I think. You do see what administrations do, what procedural effects do reasonably well in looking at cost-benefit data. Some of the knowledge that we have about midnight regulations that come out at the end of a presidential term, which we, of course, are just about to come to, comes from good data on costs and benefits, and the fact that they both go up a lot at the end of presidential administration. On the other hand, if what we're interested in is cumulative impact, if the benefit data is not great, or more importantly, the distributional data is not good, then it's really hard to assess who's bearing this impact, who's benefiting from regulations, and how do we think about that? The Biden administration, as many of you know, may know, has started to require distributional analysis of regulations in its impact analysis. We will see how well that is done. I am dubious. And in any case, it will be years before we have distributional measures on a large number of regulations, and we can start to think about them in that way. But it is a step forward for sure. But it is also a very hard question. Okay. Having spent most of my career and most of this talk criticizing things, I also do at least want to put forth some ideas as to what we can think, what else we could do to better count regulatory impacts. And there are two ideas at very different extremes. The first is the Paperwork Reduction Act, passed in 1980 here in the United States, requires agencies to get approvals for every time they want to collect information from 10 or more individuals. There are challenges with the act for sure, but one thing it has produced is a massive amount of data on agency imposition of information collection burdens on the public. Every time an agency does this, and they have to renew their approvals every 3 years, they have to calculate the burden being imposed. And theoretically, they're also supposed to explain the benefit that comes from imposing that burden, that they don't have to quantify. This data is all available on the web. It's a nightmare to navigate through manually, but it provides a source of data, perhaps using technology. And I am not a technology person. I'm the first to admit that. When something goes wrong on my computer, I turn it on and off still. But I think there is potential there to use that data to better understand cumulative impacts. On the other extreme, I think we need to do more qualitative work in regulatory impact. I think we need to talk to the people that are impacted by regulation. We need to understand businesses, the burdens that are imposed on them, and the ways they cope with those burdens, not just from the federal government, which almost every analysis here I've mentioned has focused on, but also state and local governments. On the flip side, we need to understand cumulative benefits. How many people's lives are made substantially better by the fact that the air is cleaner, by the fact that they're safer when they go to work, or they are the food they eat is safer. And we just have not done enough of that on a small scale. There's some, and there's some good work on individual industries, for example, that has been done, but we don't do nearly enough of it. And it would help us understand, I think, the real questions that we're trying to get at here. So that is everything. I have the URL for the publication up there. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I can also drop the URL in the chat.
Neil, do you want to manage the discussion? And thanks, Stuart.
Yes, thank you very much, Stuart. Let us begin with, I have a few questions, perhaps David have two, and then we can open up the debate for the audience. And to start with, I would like to address a few questions about burden more generally. You started by presenting some common measures of regulations, of the way scholars counting regulation, and then you went more deeply into the idea of burden, but you haven't discussed much the notion or the way you understand burden. And at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned a bit, you said something about physical burden and mental burden, but more generally, how do you understand burden? And more specifically, if we understand that the recipients of regulations vary, some regulations target businesses, some individuals, some organizations, some the government itself. And those recipients have different capacities to cope with burden, be it paperwork or other stuff. What is your perspective on this? If we have a measure of, for example, cumulative hours of burden, and we have different recipients with different capacities to cope with regulation, what is your perspective on this? And the next comment I have is about the subjective measures you discussed at the end of your talk. And many people in the US believe there is too much regulations. At least if we take the last 20 years, according to Gallup, nearly half of the respondents say that there is too much regulation, and the rest split it between right amount or too little regulation. And I assume similar sentiment exists also in other countries, and of course, more extremely across firms and businesses. And these perceptions usually do not correlate with the actual number of regulations and documents. So my question is how we can improve regulations or ways to count regulation and think about it more qualitatively, sorry, if the public and organizations perceived it negatively, or what could subjective measures play in addressing this negativity bias? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Those are great questions. So I use the term burden in part because the Paperwork Reduction Act, which started with that term. Obviously, cost-benefit analysis tends to use cost more than burden. But I think you're absolutely right that a burden on a firm and a burden on an individual falls differently and has a different impact. And if we're thinking about this in terms of impact, which we should be, then we need to take that into account. And most existing work doesn't, right? It uses a metric, whether it's an hour, a dollar, or a number of regulations that mushes things together, mushes all those things together. And I think one thing that both of the things that I've suggested does is it helps us think about taking them apart. And because the Paperwork Reduction Act submissions can relatively easily be, well, relatively easily, again, I'm betraying my lack of technical expertise here, but I suspect can easily be differentiated by those on whom the requirements are being imposed. We could look at both, and both are important. And I don't want to minimize the importance of either, but in mixing them together, we are thinking about different questions. And of course, your question alludes to sort of, I mean, the economist in me reacts and is like, yeah, what's important is the marginal impact it's having. The marginal impact of another hour being imposed on someone who doesn't have any time in their day versus another hour being imposed on Microsoft to fill out a form is not the same. And we should think about those in terms of impacts and not in terms of hours. So yes, I think that is how I think about it. I want to get more to impact than to most of the things that we've used. On to your second question, and this fascinates me. And you're 100% right that most people, when they hear the word regulation, there's a negative connotation. And To some degree, that is a victory already won by people who oppose regulation. One study, and this is a little dated, but noted that between 2006 and 2011, the phrase job-killing regulations increased in newspapers and media 11,000%. And that's because there was the decision by political actors that opposed regulations to increase their use of that phrase. And the media bought it, and it certainly has permeated into our consciousness quite a bit. I think thinking, and that's because, and then these studies add to it, and the fact that there aren't countervailing studies hurts as well, in that most of them focus on costs, and most of them focus on burdens. And that is what frames the dialogue out there. When we talk about debates, and I don't want to get too in the weeds here, like the REINS Act or the Regulatory Accountability Act, which have bounced around Congress in the United States for more than a decade, you always hear thousands of regulations, billions of dollars. You never hear the air is cleaner, the water is cleaner, et cetera. And I think studies on impact need to do a better job of thinking about cumulative benefits of regulations as much as they have talked about cumulative costs. I don't know what the results of those studies will be. Maybe the higher prices they pay, or restrictions on the job market that come from regulations, do make some people worse off than the cleaner air makes them better. But we have no idea about whether that's the case.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. I have some follow-up questions, but I will keep them for later. David, would you like to add something before? Okay.
Sure, thank you. But I see Cesar Cordova is a question, so please come in, Cesar. Yep, you are muted now. Please unmute yourself, Cesar. I see that you are there.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah, please.
Do you hear me now? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Stuart, as well as to David. My name is Cesar Cordova. I work for Jacobs Cordova and Associates. It's a firm working on regulatory reform. And I would like to go back. Excellent, by the way, excellent presentation. But I would like to go back to why things have failed, and maybe about the political economy of these failures. And I would be very interested to hear you, Stuart, about why you think it's so difficult to control the discretion, the regulatory discretion of agencies. Is it the federal administrative law that is not sufficiently tight? Is it the courts? Is it why it is so hard to just tell agencies to control their requirements, their demands? And maybe as a secondary, and I know the first one is a very tough question, but maybe the second one, why you think some of the previous US initiatives, and it was not only US, the 142 regulations, or perhaps even the more utopic regulatory budgetary initiatives, have stalled and have maybe failed. Maybe, I know it's hard questions, maybe some access for thinking about. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question and the kind words. Let me start with I'll start with the broader question on agency discretion. And again, my experience is mainly US based. I am not so sure that I think agency discretion exists. But I think on the most salient issues, on the most politically salient issues, we do have a fair amount of political control over it. It's just that we also oscillate back and forth a great deal here in the United States, but that different political actors have had different agendas, and agencies have largely followed through. Now, where there is a particular challenge is, for the legislative body to control agency discretion. And that gets to all sorts of questions that touch sort of fundamental debates here in the United States. I don't think Congress has much control over agency discretion. I think the president has a fair amount of control over it. I don't think you're going to see agencies, particularly executive branch agencies, issuing regulations that the president doesn't like unless there's a very clear legislative requirement for them to do so. And I think what we've seen is different presidents do take the regulatory state in different directions, and that is control over agencies. If, however, you believe that agencies should be an outgrowth of Congress, an outgrowth of the legislature instead, then there is very much a problem with agency discretion. And I think Congress has made itself a secondary actor in these debates, some deliberately, some hamstrung by gridlock and partisanship here in the US. And I think that's a challenge, and that gets into debates that the Supreme Court has stepped into and such that really I don't want to get into here. On your second question on specific measures like 2-for-1 and you can put the regulatory budget in there. I do think that, and I'll take the Trump administration experience since I know that best, and then they were the ones that put the 2-for-1 order in place. Certainly the Trump administration agencies in some policy areas cut back new regulations very a lot. But what they did not do is they did not get rid of existing regulations. Their verbal protests to the contrary. In part, it's because they were content, and this goes all the way up to the president, of course, they were content to brag about it without actually doing the hard work of getting rid of regulation. Because getting rid of a regulation requires the same things that putting one in place does. It requires notice and comment. It requires a whole process. And the Trump administration did not really engage in that. And when it did it poorly. The courts often rescinded or rebuked the Trump administration for getting rid of regulations sloppily. And so I think that's why it didn't work. Could an administration that was more effective, more experienced, had more than 4 years, actually put in place a 2-for-1 that was effective? I think it's possible, but you would have to have a lot of resources dedicated to it both at the political level and at the agency level.
Okay, before going to Claretta and Cesar have probably a follow-up question. David wanted to ask something, please.
Yes, thank you, Stuart, for a highly interesting and comprehensive presentation. My question goes back to the idea that we need to make some progress, significant progress in the metrics of regulation. And that what we did so far, and we have 40 or more years of, almost 50 years of reform, say, starting with the OMB and starting calculating impact of regulation, cost benefit and benefit cost and so on. We don't have the cognitive system either to capture what's going on, where are the regulation, where to capture them at the global, national, federal, regional level. Many of them are running away to all kinds of executive orders. This is one. And also we don't have any significant progress in having national accounts of the impact of regulation. Now we don't have impact accounting or system of accounting also for the dollars or the shekels or the euros that we spend, right? We spend euros. We know how much euros we spend. A lot of this is outside the budget, but still we know how much we spend, but we don't know the extra, the value added of the fiscal instrument. We don't know them on regulatory instrument, but we know where to look for the dollars mainly, and what is the cost in terms of that. And I think what we are missing is kind of a new stage in the way we counting regulation, or accounting for the performances of regulation. Do you see something ahead of us?
So, yeah, I mean, I'd like to be optimistic, right? I mean, we have all these new tools now, and theoretically they could be used to think about some of these questions. And I think it was Cesar mentioned political economy. The political economy has not been there to sort of grapple with the harder, long-term, big picture questions that you're raising. In a presidential term lasts 4 years. There's a lot of policy objectives that you want to get out of your agencies. 8 years is a little better, but still, given the way we do things, it's still not that long a period of time for thinking about these questions. And so with that time constriction, you want to get your policy initiatives out. You want to be able to make measurements that argue for your policy initiatives, but not really look at the bigger picture of cumulative impacts, cumulative benefits that is there. And so I think it would be great. I mean, people think about OMB performing this function. I don't think that's the right place, but I think it would be great if there was an office, maybe in the legislative branch, akin to what we have in the Congressional Budget Office, that thinks hard about budgetary questions and thinks about long-term, big picture questions as well, and does so in a very apolitical manner. Sometimes they run into politics and their numbers get criticized and become hot button issues, but most of the time they just do good analysis. We don't have anything like that in the regulatory world in the United States. OIRA is not that. OIRA works for the president on individual regulations. And even in my sort of putting my biggest pro OIRA hat on and calling them objective and caring about good analysis, they don't have time to think about questions like that. So we need a place where there could be analysts that think about these big picture questions, and they don't just have to be cumulative burden. They could be some of the things that are in the chat right now as well, thinking about effects on the handicapped, ethnic minorities, genders, as Charles says in the chat. Questions like that. We need an office to do that.
Yeah, or maybe we need a war, because the system of calculating GNP per capita and so on was made during the war, as you seem to know. We need another Simon Kuznets to do that. But we'll stop. Yeah. Let's bring Carleta. Carleta, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much for this talk. It's very instructive. I guess my question follows up on what David asked and a question in the chat. If I wanted to ask if you could speak more to the other categories that we should or could look at in using the data sources that you listed, to have more contextual and meaningful counts of regulation. And also, if we thinking of your proposal to use LLM models in the future to analyze the available data, we would also need to instruct the model. So how would you more fine grain this investigation more?
Yeah, and I'm a little self-conscious about the fact that, on the one hand, I call for nuance, and on the other hand, I'm calling for using these models which are not known for nuance. And It's interesting, the experience in using some of these models to count regulatory restrictions, on the one hand, shows us the flaws there, but also I think at least shows some glimmer of promise. I mean, I'm not a programmer, so I can't tell you exactly how we would program these models. But if one, thought about particularly looking at the PRA, Paperwork Reduction Act submissions, one looked for, who is burdened and what people are bearing the burden, or is it firms, or is it a particular industry? And the benefits would be harder because they're not quantified in the PRA submissions, but they are supposed to, there was a question there like, well, what are we going to get out of this? If there is a way to sort of look at agency answers to that, we might take a step towards cumulative benefits, which is admittedly significantly harder, but shouldn't be ignored just because it's harder.
Thank you, Stuart. I want to add here, and just to ask you, maybe how you envision the information from the Paperwork Act. What kind of information do you envision of collecting or thinking about it, and how can it be aggregated? And maybe the most central question in this regard is essentially is how what you're proposing actually withstands with the critique that you direct at the existing measures of regulation.
Yeah, it's much easier to criticize than to propose, for sure. In my ideal world, we could use this data to answer question, or to make statements like an individual receiving benefits from 3 federal programs spends 6 hours a week filling out the paperwork to get those benefits. And that's too much, that's too little, that's just right. We can think about that, but we don't know that right now. And if we could answer that question, I think it would illuminate some of the debates around that. On the industry, on the firm side, we could look at questions like, businesses in this industry need 2,000 man-hours per month to comply with federal regulations, or just with EPA regulations, or just with OSHA regulations. This is a percentage of the workforce for large firms that is this percent, but for small firms it is this percent. And in an ideal world, we get to questions like that, and then we move from there. On the benefit side, from regulations that firms have to comply, and EPA has done this once or twice in its existence, to be fair. The air is this much cleaner, and this many life years have been added to the American public as a result of environmental regulations. I don't think any other agency that I know of has done analysis like this. I don't know that I believe the EPA analysis, but at least they tried. At least they went and they asked that question and tried to get an answer to it and put it out there for criticism and hopefully improvement. Hopefully we can continue doing that.
Thank you. Any more questions?
There's one more in the chat I haven't read yet.
Could I jump in? Perhaps it's Johannes Bauer at Michigan State University, and I couldn't find the raise hand function here for some reason. So
I've had that problem myself.
And I also apologize. I was sidetracked in another meeting for part of your Q&A session. So you may have already talked about this. I should say also that I'm currently on leave from my university position at a regulatory agency, and so I'm dealing with the issues that you discussed on a daily basis, right? And without necessarily being able to go into details, I should say there's a couple of major challenges, right? I mean, it's from the regulatory perspective that might sort of influence the quality of data that you get, for example, on the costs of regulation, because frequently in sort of some types of regulations, it's almost impossible to quantify the likely costs and benefits, and it's in many cases impossible, at least at the agency where I'm at, to look at the distributional effects. And it's not theoretically impossible, but it's impossible because the data collections that we have available to assess those effects are so incomplete or not available in the public domain that in many cases, we have to make wild guesses. But there's also a theoretical reason, and that is that frequently, almost any regulatory choice now, I'm sort of in the communication space, can say that much, right? Affects stakeholders differentially. There's some who benefit and others who might lose, and it's difficult to come up with sort of net effects of these sort of regulations frequently. And moreover, many of those players have actually options to adjust to the regulations, and this is not only a question of compliance, right? But they just change their behavior, and so facing this need to regulate an essentially dynamic process in an industry, right? I mean, it may be theoretically very difficult unless we change our methods, perhaps going to simulation models or to sort of other computational approaches to really anticipate how some of those regulations might affect things. So there's a practical aspect that I just wanted to raise as a flag of caution when looking at some of the numbers that you proposed. And then a theoretical that I think should keep our community busy as we move forward, because I think there's other sectors where the same issues will arise too.
Yeah, those are fantastic points, and I love the fact that you're bringing your agency experience to bear on them. And certainly, one concern I had about the changes to require distributional analysis is exactly what you've raised. It's that there was sort of hand waving there in terms of how we'd be able to do that, and I worry that it makes regulating, if you have to do it, you're making regulation harder and more burdensome for agencies to issue because they have to try and do these analyses now, in addition to cost-benefit analysis, which has never been easy or simple for agencies. And so I think you're right, these are very real questions, and I don't think we're going to get anything out of distributional analysis for a long time. It doesn't mean we shouldn't start down the path. Things like environmental justice are important. The fact that some communities are more affected by pollution than others, all of those are important things that we should have better understanding of. But I take to heart both your practical and theoretical difficulties there, and that we are a ways from being able to use that to meaningfully inform decision making.
So I think it's time for now to finish. Thank you so much, Stuart, for an interesting and stimulating talk. We are very happy to have you here and hope to continue to learn from you in the future.
And thank you so much for having me. Fantastic questions.
Thanks. Fantastic paper. Thank you so much. Thank you all.